Well, welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to forge some connections in our networking function and gain some points through our gamification competition. We're now moving on to our second panel to debate how public sector leaders navigate the key elements of the power generation journey and what steps can they take to break down their requirements into a manageable strategy. We look to explore this topic as local authorities are under increasing pressure for renewable and low carbon energy generation. The importance of this transformation is highlighted by the UK government's commitment to reducing UK greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. There's also increasing pressure for on-site renewable generation to reduce emissions. So here to look at alternative and renewable sources of power are Lorraine Ramani, Carbon Specialist Inspired Energy PLC, Councillor Scott Patient, Cabinet Member, Climate Change and Resilience, Calderdale Council, Frank Gordon, Director of Policy, Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology, and Hannah Evans, Manager of Energy Systems at Carbon Trust. And as for the last panel, remember to submit your questions using the live Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll get to as many of those as possible. So welcome to all of my panelists. Thank you very much for joining us. Frank, we were close to the wire there. I wasn't sure whether we'd got you, but I'm really delighted to say that you're here, so that's good. Hannah, we'll start off with you, if we may. You're at Carbon Trust. How do public sector leaders navigate their power generation decarbonisation journey? That's a fairly major question. Over to you.
Thanks, Helen, and great to see everyone this morning. Yeah, it's a big question, and I think part of a kind of broader question as to how we get to net zero as a country by 2050. I think power generation is a really important part of that, and local authorities can play a really important role in enabling kind of local generation and also local storage and flexibility assets to be deployed. I'm sure kind of everyone listening is aware that there's kind of fewer and fewer incentives for the generation side of the equation, but there's still a lot of support out there to help local authorities get through the kind of project development side and identify where and when they can best deploy renewable energy. But it is a really important part of the wider decarbonisation mix, including kind of helping people decarbonise their homes and decarbonise transport as well at a local level.
Scott, tell us what's happening at Calderdale Council.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having us. I mean, all sorts of projects are happening really. In terms of, I mean, we're an area that floods, so we have a lot of work in terms of adaptation as well as mitigation. We're trying to do carbon capture projects. We're also part of the public sector decarbonisation scheme, where we're adding ground and air source heat pumps to a number of our sort of buildings in and around the place, putting PV in place and trying to, I just guess, get around some of the constraints what we have in terms of the feed-in tariff by thinking about how we manage wind power locally, and look for sort of smaller sites as well where we can do more PV arrays and stuff. But we do have limitations in Calderdale. We don't have big wide open spaces. We're a free space, so I guess we are looking for some of those changes in policy to enable us to just go a bit further and faster.
That's a good start to hearing what you're up to. Frank, is there one single approach to decarbonising the power system in the UK? Or I'm guessing that you're probably going to tell me it's a mix that's needed.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, and great to be on this panel. Thank you for the organisers. Just to flag as well, unfortunately, I need to leave at 10:55 for we've been pulled into an urgent civil servants meeting, so apologies about that. But I'll be here until then. So yes, unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's no silver bullet. There are a range of technologies, a range of options we need to look at. So as well as wind, solar, some of those more established renewable technologies. There's some of the less established technologies coming through, such as marine, wave and tidal, for example. A range of bioenergy technologies, such as biomass power, biomass heat, waste to energy, and advanced conversion thermal, for example. And in combination with those, we really need energy efficiency so that we reduce the total amount of energy that we're consuming in the first place, because that will help us reach renewables quicker. And alongside renewables, we need more flexible capacity, such as energy storage, demand-side response, and smart electric vehicle charging. And those initiatives and technologies will help us manage the system in a smarter way, in a greener way, and smooth the energy transition to what we hope can be 100% renewables in the next few decades.
Lorraine, certainly last but not least, how can carbon footprinting help public sector leaders navigate this decarbonisation journey, do you think?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me as well today. It's nice to see you all. Yeah, working on carbon footprinting, I suppose the public sector has already been gathering a lot of its data for a good few years now. So, they're building that awareness of their, like, understanding their emissions that come from what they generate themselves in their own organizations, from their electrical or from their fleet vehicles as well, from what they purchase, the kind of energy that they're purchasing. This understanding is being developed, as well as what their business travel might be and the emissions that come from their energy management systems. So I suppose, like, the first step really is understanding where you're producing these emissions, and understanding what the big emitters are in order to develop your decarbonisation strategy. So it's great that the public sector have been gathering this data for a while, and also that they're going, like, wider as well. They're thinking about, like, climate change adaptation, sustainable procurement, biodiversity action plans. So it's like the holistic picture of what we need to do to decarbonise.
And just sticking with you for a second, Lorraine, I mean, where do the biggest carbon emissions in power generation come from currently? What activities demand the most power, and how can we look to reduce that?
Yeah, I suppose, you need to look at your building energy demand. It's a big thing. And also there's the transport, the emissions that come from the transportation. So yeah, I mean, getting to grips with how your buildings are demanding energy in order to reduce it is a great place to start. Like Frank said, energy efficiency, reducing the demand is what we need to do first, and then figuring out how to decarbonize that energy.
So Hannah, once you've identified feasible renewable energy projects, what are the main challenges in actually delivering those projects, do you think?
Yeah, so I think as Lorraine was saying, the local authorities are doing a huge amount, to look at climate change and improving the environment of their local area. And I think that kind of, identifying kind of what technically can be done is the first really important step. But I think what we've seen through some of the work that some of my colleagues have done through the Welsh Government Energy Service, which supports local authorities to deliver renewable generation projects, is that actually kind of the technical side is only kind of one small part. A really big challenge can be understanding the kind of the project development process and needing support through that journey, but also finding kind of the right commercial model for your project, and getting access to kind of the right finance and advice around that finance as well. And then just the process of kind of getting stakeholder engagement, buy-in, so both from people within the council and also local residents, to make sure that everyone's bought into the projects that you're looking to undertake, to kind of maximise the benefit that they bring to the local community.
I'm mindful that we will lose Frank shortly, so maybe just devote a couple of minutes to Frank before you have to go off to your meeting, Frank. I mean, just first of all, just your response to what you just heard there. Any bits to add on that before we move on to the other aspects?
Sure, and apologies again about the last
worry.
thing. It's just last night that it came up.
Don't worry.
I think, as has been mentioned, energy efficiency, it always gets forgotten. It's not a very sexy subject in some ways, but it's really crucial that we don't forget energy efficiency and the energy hierarchy, as it's known, which is kind of reduce and then reduce your usage, become as energy efficient as possible, and then look to how you can change your source of generation using renewables. And like I was saying earlier, adding to that is the need for flexibility in the future as well. So if you're looking at your estates, for example, and thinking about on-roof solar, is it a good idea to think about a battery storage device as well, for example? And if you're putting in electric vehicle charging points, it's great to ensure that those are smart chargers, which means that they can respond flexibly to remote signals over the air, via the internet and so forth. And that will allow us to smooth the energy transition, but also it should deliver added savings to the organizations taking those steps as well. So I think that the power sector is really crucial, and there's lots of things we can do around power generation to really add those benefits in.
Good. And also, just sticking with you a moment, Frank, who can companies talk to when they're looking to decarbonize their own businesses? What kind of help and guidance is out there?
Sure. I mean, the Energy Saving Trust is a good neutral government-backed source of advice, which is fairly high level but very useful. There's a lot of very good consultancies out there, and other bodies such as the Carbon Trust. And there's a range of associations such as ourselves, the REA, and others who can help organisations on that journey. We've got a list of members on our website, which is www.r-e-a.net, and you can search by postcode and by technology that you might be interested in, and find a reputable installer in your area, for example. So there's a range of resources like that.
Oh, fantastic. I think that's really useful. Scott, it looks like you want to add there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm just going to build on that around the sort of flexibility. And clearly there is some great consultancy work out there. I know we've had support from Hindi within Bays, for some of the work that we've been doing, which has sort of been really helpful. And I think that flexibility in terms of, bids as well, looking to do perhaps smaller microgrid projects, which do have those sort of shared savings for users, is really helpful. But I think the reality is that there's extra on costs as well, which perhaps aren't thought about when we're bidding for these things, and it's about the capacity in the grid, perhaps the need to add substations to build energy capacity in those spaces, and as well as as was sort of mentioned earlier, that consultation needs an on cost for local authorities at the moment, in terms of revenue. So there are some kind of bits that need working out here, and I think just a bit more of it needs some focused work in certain spaces, but perhaps the whole approach needs a bit more of a broader brush.
We are getting lots of questions in, so I'm hoping that you're going to help me out here, because the questions are coming in sort of blind for me. It's quite difficult to read them all and allocate them to somebody. So if we have a listen, and perhaps someone can volunteer to answer the various bits that are most relevant to each panelist. Cara says, how can LAs support community energy organisations and through PPAs utilise the renewable energy generation for council's energy requirements?
Could I take that one and then maybe head off after that?
Of course, no problem. Go for it, Frank.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's a great aim as well. Used to be involved in a community energy organisation, and I think they're doing great things. So that is to help the local community around where energy generation is taking place to actually own those assets or benefit from those assets in some other ways, which are tangible, such as share ownership or reduce energy bills. So that is absolutely fantastic. I think there's a few sources of grant funding for those organisations out there from Bays and others. So there's lots which can be done to signpost them to those organisations. There's a good organisation called Community Energy England, and equivalents also in Scotland and Wales, which groups of community groups, and they provide support and signposting to various sources of information as well. And I think it was mentioned off-takes as well. So I think if the council can provide an off-take agreement for a community-owned PPA, that would be fantastic, because one of their biggest challenges they have is to sell their power at a sustainable price, and particularly for the longer term, because they'll be looking to bring in debt funding potentially alongside their equity raise, and that requires a proven long-term revenue source from a credit-worthy off-taker, and obviously local authorities would be extremely credit-worthy and could provide that longer-term source of finance and buying the power. So I think, looking to help those community groups in those ways with signposting to support and grant funding, and then, like I said, buying the power potentially from such projects would be another way of doing that.
Very good question, very good answer, and we're sorry to lose you, but I'm really glad that you were able to join us for the first 15 minutes. So really appreciate your time. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you to the organisers. Sorry to duck off, but very happy to share my contact details with anyone who'd like to discuss further. Yeah, I've put our website on the chat function, so if anyone would like to go there, there's more information there as well. So thank you again very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'll carry on with some questions from the audience, if I may, because we've got a lot of them coming in. Claire says that hand in hand with doing our bit, how can town and parish councils and local authorities encourage our communities to adopt a culture of reducing carbon footprint without assuming that they'll either be missing out on something or that it'll cost them a lot of money? Scott, do you feel you can take that one?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I kind of hate to say this really, but I think town and parish councils perhaps have more of flexibility to be able to do projects perhaps where borough councils don't. And I'm thinking about that in terms of how they can raise the precept, you know, in terms of the kind of work that they do. So in Calderdale, we have a number of parish councils that have declared climate emergency. Where I live in Hebden Royd, obviously we flood a lot, and down the road in Todmorden. And I think the work that they're doing in terms of that engagement is really locally focused. They are that sort of first rung of local government. They are close to the people, and they're people that live in the same community. So I think reaching them is easier. There's a trust there that perhaps doesn't exist always between borough councils and the constituents, because they're actually seeing those people there. So I feel like there is a greater flexibility and a definite need to work within those structures where possible, but at the same time a recognition that parish and town councils don't cover all of necessarily the space of those boroughs. So perhaps a external thinking from the borough council about what can be learned from those partners.
Great. We've got a question from Nigel. Nigel wants to know, how do you assess the carbon footprint of a local area so that you know what reduction you need to achieve for carbon neutrality? Lorraine, is that fall into your area?
Yeah. So of a local area, is that like who would be responsible there for the carbon footprint that they're calculating? I'm just wondering.
I think that's what he means. I've actually deleted it now, but yes, that's the impression I got. Like
a local authority or something like that. Yeah. So I suppose, you know, you would just start like the greenhouse gas protocol, you know, has a kind of reporting standard that it recommends. So you start with your first kind of group of emissions, which is your scope 1 emissions, which is, say you're a local authority, what are you responsible for? Like, what is your organization producing? Like, say, do you have any boilers on site, or do you have any vehicle fleet that you operate as well? So first you would be calculating those emissions. And then the scope 2 emissions is you start to think about what energy are you purchasing to run your buildings and things? So what electricity and heat and cooling are you purchasing? And then your scope 3 emissions, you're starting to look at the kind of supply chain that goes, like the upstream emissions, like things that you purchase into your organization, and then the downstream, what people use, the services that they use, that you run. So I suppose that's the kind of beginnings of the carbon footprint. That's the kind of the 3 key areas that you need to look at in your organization and along your supply chain. Thank you. Hannah, do you want to add anything there?
I think, yeah, just adding to Lorraine's point, I think often, like the question was around kind of those local authorities and their carbon footprint, but often there'll be other organisations in a local area that also kind of looking at their own carbon footprint, or looking at future energy scenarios to try and understand how they need to adapt it according to kind of changes elsewhere in the energy system. So particularly thinking about distribution network operators, so those kind of not the kind of national transmission system, but those operating the local electricity networks will have all gone through processes to look at their future energy scenarios and understand what they need to invest in over the next 5, 10, 15 years in order to allow for the transition towards net zero. And part of that will be ensuring that you can then connect kind of renewable generation, but also things like heat pumps and electric vehicle charging is also a really important part of that consideration. So there's a lot of work going on amongst both the gas and electricity networks to understand what they need to do to enable that local transition to happen.
And Chris, Hannah makes sort of following on from that, really, he's saying, Chris might be male or female, I'm not sure. Are there any effective ways of different bodies MATs, LAs, NHS trusts, etc., working together on district heat networks and sharing the benefits of renewable generation?
Yes, yeah. So district heat networks aren't my my area of expertise, but there are colleagues at the Carbon Trust who focus on getting district heat networks off the ground, and it's historically in the UK been quite tricky to get heat networks underway. But we see lots of examples from continental Europe that they can often be the dominant heating solution in and considered the norm within sort of towns and cities. So it's definitely doable, and I think that sort of stakeholder engagement piece is really important. And I think there's guidance actually that BEIS published a couple of years ago around how do you kind of bring together the relevant stakeholders to get kind of heat networks underway, and what process do you need to follow to get that project, to deliver that project successfully. I think more broadly, the kind of who talks to who is always a really tricky question. I think not just within the energy sector, but I think in any job I've done, it's always been trying to get the right people in the room at the same time is half the battle. But I think there are lots of networks and groups that are trying to do that. So I know that the Carbon Trust hosts the Public Sector Network, which is an opportunity for local authorities to sort of ask questions about we're looking at trying to decarbonise this particular buildings, and got any tips, or to share best practice from local authorities that have just delivered a really good energy efficiency or generation project that they want to shout about. So there are those networks out there. It's just a case of tapping into them. But I think it's an ongoing challenge to bring everyone together.
My apologies, Lorraine. Sorry, do you just add on from there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Leeds City Council is a really good example to look at now for the district heating system. That they're getting heat from household waste powered. They're powering and there's going to be like 2,000 households that are going to benefit, and like 6 local authority buildings. So it's one to keep an eye on.
It's good to have examples like that. I'm just apologising, Lorraine, because I deleted Nigel's question so quickly that when you asked me to repeat it, it wasn't there. And Nigel says, back again, I was asking about the area, not the organisation.
The area.
Sorry, Nigel.
Okay. Yeah, well, I suppose that's taken in the wider things then, isn't it? Like climate change, adaptation as well, and like sustainable construction or biodiversity action plans. I suppose you need to be thinking about all the transport systems within the area, all the buildings within the area, and how the natural spaces are used as well. I think it's a little bit more complicated to do a whole area, but it is possible.
Scott, we've all been through, the last 18 months of the pandemic as a nation. And, I think a lot of people are being affected by austerity, aren't they? And, perhaps the lead to risk-averse financial teams. How do we convince the people who are holding the purse strings that we need to do more and, and do it faster, if you like?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly, I think I don't think anyone would argue that most finance bods lean naturally sort of towards the conservative area, and I mean that with a small c. So I think we just need to have an honest conversation with them. I think most local authorities have sort of declared their ambitions in terms of climate action, and those that haven't, I think, are sort of on that way, on the way to that journey. So I think there just needs to be an understanding about what the longer term benefits are. I mean, even economists are putting a price on the lack of carbon action by the end of the century. So there is some good practice out there in terms of being able to have those discussions. I think, though, broader and more nationally, I mean, we've got COP26 coming up. Surely that's got to be a catalyst for change. One would hope, and the IPCC are making recommendations that the target comes down. And with that needs to come that investment. So I think what we're hoping for is a step change, really, in sort of how financial bods think about that long-term future, and not in the case of 20 or 30 years, but in the case of about a century, or actually thinking a little bit further. So we do need to challenge. I think we do need to have discussions. But you're right, austerity has taken a toll. Our council is 100 million worse off than it was 10 years ago, and with and with that comes capacity issues, and it's all well and good us having big capital projects that are happening here, there, and everywhere, but it's making sure that they're controlled and implemented with sustainability and the future of the planet and the local authority in mind.
Yeah. Alistair's asking, many councils are undergoing the process of producing a local plan. Attached to this is central government's desire for an additional 9,000 houses to be developed in these districts. How much has this added to the challenge of reaching future targets? Go on. You're going to go for it, Scott.
I'm happy to do that, because we've got a local plan that's maybe 4 or 5 months away, that's about to go to its last round of inspection. It's a really difficult one. It's a political hot topic, isn't it, and a favourite of other rival political parties to have various discussions on, especially at full council. But I think what's key is making sure it's robust, making sure that the carbon reduction target within it is robust. We're currently developing a set of sort of place and design based SPDs that sit on top of it, addressing issues like biodiversity, air quality, and NFM, sustainable urban drainage. So I think making sure that those are all baked into the local plan from the get-go, and that we make sure that the people on the planning department, and that's officers and councillors, understand what those SPDs mean, and that they are robust, and that they actually should be a framework for how any future development is managed. We have some garden suburbs or eco villages as part of our project, but again, even if you put a road in there that's required as part of the infrastructure, that has its own issues. So just making sure that our procurement is local, making sure that everything we do really is robust within a council.
Cool. Question from Karen, I think possibly for you, Lorraine. Is there any work being completed to encourage energy companies to provide financial support to facilitate energy efficiencies?
So I work not for an energy company as such, but one that advises people on how to use their energy.
Is that something you'd be able to answer, or not really your?
Not really my,
Hannah, is it?
My knowledge is probably a bit out of date. I know there was definitely the eco program which required energy suppliers to put aside a pot of money to help fund energy efficiency, with a focus on those in fuel poverty. I believe that's come to an end, but as I say, it's not my area of expertise. But I believe there's still some obligations to kind of fund efficiency measures within homes. But as I say, I'm not up to date with my knowledge on that one.
Fair enough. Cara wants to know, how can the UK learn and include solutions that other countries are already doing, e.g. more support for community renewable installations for community energy consumption? And can we learn from what's happening elsewhere?
I suppose there's a good example of, in Germany, how they managed to get a better uptake of solar and wind energy, purchasing of that by having like a feed-in tariff that the people who buy the renewables then get refunded some money, and then they added that cost to the bill of all the consumers in Germany, and the uptake of solar and wind really rocketed, and so did the demand then for that technology, and then the reduced cost of that technology happened as well. But then it had some side effects too, where the price of the electricity bill went up, so that some people couldn't afford to pay. So you need to think about the bigger picture, but that seems to be a good example of getting the uptake to speed up.
Hannah, you were nodding there. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think sometimes the examples from overseas can just be almost a catalyst to kind of show you what's possible. So I mentioned like district heating previously. Like if you were just kind of focusing on the UK, might almost think it's a bit of a intractable problem. But we've seen it done elsewhere, and I think that gives us kind of that incentive to keep trying. I saw something recently on LinkedIn about electric vehicle sales in Norway, and they're now kind of overtaking sales of fossil fueled vehicles, which is great. And 5 years ago, you would have a lot of people would have been like, that's not possible, we couldn't do that. And yet it's happened relatively quickly due to the policy framework that they've got in place in Norway to deliver that. So I think it's looking at kind of those positive examples to give us some sense of direction and a bit of kind of hope, I suppose, as to what's possible within a relatively short time frame. You mentioned the pandemic. We've seen huge amounts of change over the last 18 months, and I think we need that same I suppose kind of drive to deal with climate change.
Do you look elsewhere, Scott, when you're coming up for ideas where you are at the council? Do you sometimes look to other countries to see what they're doing and what their successes are and what their learnings are, I suppose?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it'd be foolhardy not to, really. We don't have all the solutions here, but I think elsewhere, especially in the Scandinavian countries, they've done some incredible work. And so have our neighbours. There's actually good practice to be found in and around the UK. In terms of district heat, in terms of electric grid and EV vehicles. We've just got a trial out for some of our waste management vehicles, trialing electric vehicles, which is really difficult. We're a really hilly area, so we'll kind of see how that goes, and just to try some different things. I think we need to look at innovation. I think we need to. There is stuff out there, and just try and learn from it. But as well as doing that, I think most local councils, despite austerity, do have a lot of talent in there that are real geeks for this sort of stuff, that are actually looking for that work in the first place. So I think we're well placed, and there's a good body of work out there to draw from.
Sarah says, you, Lorraine, mentioned sustainable procurement. Do you have any good examples of how this is being undertaken?
Well, I suppose within companies now, the commitments, like asking your supplier to make commitments to become net zero as well, is one that's really kind of driving change. And then, yeah, I suppose that's like a really big one. But then, like, becoming aware of the kind of emissions that are being created throughout the supply chain, and then starting to work with supply chains, like supplier engagement. That's really going to bring the change as well that's needed. But I suppose I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but I do know that there's companies coming to us because their company, who they supply to, has made them agree to science-based targets within the next 2 years and stuff. So it's really kind of driving the change through the supply chains that we are starting to see happen.
Heather asks, are we working on marine and wave power? In Brighton, we have a wind farm off the coast. What can we put forward idea-wise to our councils? Any wind or wave power going on your way, Scott?
Well, no, I mean, not wave. Times, unfortunately, we are landlocked here. But yeah, I mean, should hopefully be lots of opportunity to do, hydro-based sort of power initiatives. Tariff makes things quite difficult on that front. That's not to say it's a complete barrier, but yeah, I mean, onshore wind is I think is going to be a massive growth area in the future. Again, recently a site came up which was already being run as a sort of wind farm, but there are some procurement issues now which prohibit local councils from buying those. But as we sort of mentioned earlier, we do have a lot of community-based energy projects around here, and I think it's trying to encourage those. There's lots of good practice they've learned and stumbled along the way, but have taken grants from us and some of that support and expertise. So I think there's room for that. I think there's definitely a step change in how people see onshore wind. There is less of a sort of kind of NIMBY attitude towards them, I think, broadly. Although there are some issues in terms of the rural nature of them and getting that power supply to them. So still some stumbling blocks, I think, but a lot of opportunity in terms of where we're at culturally.
Yeah, and also just in a front page story in one of the broadsheets yesterday, I noticed about wind, and because we've had quite a calm summer, I think the wind generation hasn't delivered as much as expected. So there's a lot more pressure on the grid. I was reading yesterday, poor old Nigel Lang. I'm sorry, Nigel, you're still tuned in. You must be so frustrated. Nigel, Lorraine says, back yet again. What I'm asking about is, how do you find out what the net carbon footprint of an area is so that you have a clear target for your carbon reduction projects? Sorry, Nigel, we'll get there in the end.
Yeah, I think that there's been some recommendations in the chat here, because what I use with companies that I work with is the greenhouse gas protocol, and then here there's some tools that say BEIS produce data on CO2 emissions for local authority areas, and there's a carbon calculator for towns and parish councils, impacttool.org. And then, so I think maybe looking up those wider area tools might be more suitable for Nigel.
Scott,
What does Scott or Hannah have to
do you
say?
want to add that, Scott or Hannah?
Yeah, I mean, sort of nothing to argue with that. I mean, certainly we look towards BEIS and some of the energy regulators in terms of baselining our carbon emissions. I think that's like standard practice. We do obviously do it in-house as well, which is easier to monitor, you know, to look at our transport emissions, to look at our fleet, you know, to look at our sort of public sector buildings. But to do it more broadly, I don't think anyone's cracked it beyond doing that. There is a lag. They're normally sort of 2 years out of date. So it's a bit of an imperfect practice at the moment, especially with the last 18 months that we've got. But I think that broadly speaking, that's how it's done.
Hannah, final thought before we wrap the panel.
I was just going to mention, I think local area energy plans increasingly being used to kind of help baseline. And I think there's a methodology available through BEIS and Ofgem's website that set out kind of good practice for how you go about doing those plans, which look at not just baselining, but then also kind of future energy scenarios. And there's a number of organisations, including the Carbon Trust, who will then work with local authorities to kind of help them through that process. But as Scott and Lorraine said, it's a methodology that's still kind of being developed and is one that I think is a lot of people are really looking at in a lot of detail because it's a really important part of allowing local authorities to then plan for their future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who took part in this panel. It really has been interesting to weigh up the advantages and challenges involved with renewable energy options. And I do hope that we got Nigel his answer there. Finally, sorry about that, Nigel. We're going to take a break now, which means another opportunity to network with other delegates. It's also a chance to relax, recharge and process all the knowledge that's been shared already. So enjoy. Our next session starts at 11:35. So I'll see you then.